Welcome to True Crime Threads. An affair with the babysitter leads to a deadly twist. The Harris family was the picture of suburban perfection. Their home was nestled in a quiet neighborhood where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns spoke of wealth and stability. Scott Harris, a successful businessman, worked long hours but always made sure to be home for dinner. Clara, his wife, was a stay-at-home mom who devoted herself entirely to raising their daughter, Sophie, who was 4 years old. Their life seemed to follow a routine smooth and predictable, with every moment accounted for. But beneath the surface, the demands of daily life had begun to wear on Clara. As much as she loved her daughter, the constant juggling of chores, errands, and Sophie's needs was exhausting. Scott, with his demanding job, wasn't able to share the burden as much as Clara had hoped. They had once been a young, carefree couple, but now the pressures of parenthood and work had left Clara feeling drained and lonely. The solution, Scott suggested one evening over dinner, was to hire a babysitter. Clara hesitated at first. She had always prided herself on being a devoted mother, but she recognized that she needed help. She agreed, and the search for the right person began. They found Rachel, a bright and eager 18-year-old who had recently graduated from high school. Her references were impeccable. She had worked for a few families in the neighborhood, and everyone spoke highly of her gentle demeanor and responsibility. Rachel was calm and dependable, and her glowing reviews quickly convinced Clara she was the right choice. When Rachel first arrived at the Harris home, she struck Clara as kind and well-spoken, with a warm smile and a reassuring presence. Clara felt an immediate sense of trust, which was crucial, considering the growing demands of her day-to-day life. Rachel's first few days went smoothly. She arrived on time, took care of Sophie, and was always polite and respectful. Scott, too, noticed Rachel's charm, but he wasn't overly concerned. He was more focused on his work, which required long hours and frequent business trips. Rachel's presence in the house allowed him to focus more on his career without the guilt of leaving his wife to handle everything alone. Clara seemed relieved, and that made Scott happy. At first, Rachel's role was straightforward. She would watch Sophie for a few hours in the evenings while Clara ran errands or had some time to herself. Sophie seemed to take a liking to Rachel, and Clara felt assured that she was in good hands. Over the next few weeks, Rachel's visits became more routine. She would arrive around 5 p.m., shortly before Scott came home from work, and would leave after Sophie had gone to bed. It was a simple arrangement, one that worked perfectly for everyone involved. But as time went on, Rachel started to linger. At first, it was just a few extra minutes here and there, offering to help Clara clean up after dinner, or chatting with Scott about Sophie's day. Clara, grateful for the extra help, didn't think much of it. Scott, on the other hand, found Rachel's presence more and more comforting. She was friendly, easy to talk to, and seemed genuinely interested in his life. When Clara was occupied with household tasks or Sophie's bedtime routine, Rachel and Scott would occasionally find themselves alone, having casual conversations about work, hobbies, and life. To Scott, it was nothing more than simple, harmless conversation. But the ease with which they spoke to each other, the way Rachel listened intently to his stories, began to make him feel a connection he hadn't realized he was missing. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first, but in hindsight it was clear that the foundation of something far more complicated was slowly being laid. The Harris family, on the surface, seemed as perfect as ever. But beneath that glossy exterior, the cracks were starting to show, unnoticed by Clara, who believed everything was still in order. And Rachel? She was about to become much more than just a babysitter. As the weeks went by, the dynamic between Scott and Rachel subtly shifted. What had started as casual conversations grew into something more. At first, it was just the harmless exchange of compliments, how Scott admired Rachel's work ethic, or how Rachel would compliment Scott on his achievements at work. It seemed innocent enough, a mere rapport between an employer and an employee, but it began to cross into territory neither of them had anticipated. Rachel, still young and impressionable, found herself drawn to Scott in a way she hadn't experienced before. He was confident, well-spoken, and undeniably attractive. She had grown up surrounded by the trappings of suburban life, but Scott represented a world she hadn't quite understood, one of success, sophistication, and stability. When she first started working for the Harris family, she never imagined it would lead to anything more than a simple babysitting job. But as she spent more time with Scott, she couldn't help but notice how differently he treated her compared to other people. He had a way of listening that made her feel seen and special, something she hadn't experienced in her life before. Scott, meanwhile, had become accustomed to Rachel's presence. It was an easy comfort, a break from the pressures of his life and marriage. He admired her carefree attitude, her ability to laugh at anything, and how she seemed to genuinely care about his day-to-day life. His marriage to Clara, while stable, had become routine over the years, and the pressures of fatherhood and his demanding career had left him feeling disconnected from his wife. Clara was often preoccupied with Sophie, and though they loved each other, their relationship had grown distant. The spark that had once existed between them had been replaced by a functional partnership built on the logistics of daily life. Rachel, in contrast, made him feel younger again, more alive. She was different from Clara in ways that were difficult to articulate but easy to feel. There was an energy about Rachel that Scott found intoxicating. What began as simple pleasantries soon turned into longer, more personal conversations. He would often find himself lingering around the house after work, just to chat with her. Their interactions became more frequent, more intimate in nature, though neither of them openly acknowledged it. It was as if the more they spoke, the more they shared, the harder it became to pull back. Rachel began to stay longer after her shifts ended, offering to help Scott with things around the house, cleaning up the kitchen, folding laundry, or even making him a drink. Each time she stayed a little longer, Scott's appreciation for her grew. She would laugh at his jokes, nod understandingly when he spoke about the stresses of his job, and always seemed so attentive. It was the kind of attention he hadn't realized he was missing. Clara, on the other hand, was often too tired to even notice. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their family life, and never questioned Rachel's extended hours. Soon, the small gestures turned into something more charged. There were moments when Scott and Rachel would accidentally touch as they passed something between them, and the tension in the air would become almost palpable. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it was clear something had changed. The lines between professional and personal had started to blur, and the more they interacted, the more their connection grew. Clara, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the growing chemistry between her husband and the babysitter. She trusted Rachel completely, and the thought that anything could be amiss never crossed her mind. She was grateful for the help, even if it meant her husband seemed to spend more time at home talking to Rachel than ever before. It didn't seem like a problem until the moment when it started to be too late to ignore. Rachel, sensing the shift in Scott's behavior, began to test the waters. She would dress a little more casually around him, choosing outfits that showed more skin than she usually did. She would laugh a little longer at his jokes, linger a little closer when handing him something. Scott didn't push her away. Instead, he found himself drawn in by her attention. It was thrilling, in a way he hadn't expected. He had no intention of crossing a line, but with each passing day, the temptation grew harder to resist. Rachel wasn't just a babysitter anymore. She had become something far more complicated, a reflection of everything Scott had been missing, and he found it impossible to ignore the pull between them. It was no longer just a simple friendship, it had become something dangerous, and neither of them had the clarity to step back before it was too late. One evening, after a long day at work, Scott found himself sitting alone in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine. Clara had taken Sophie to a friend's house for a playdate, and the house felt unusually quiet. He was looking forward to the time alone, but instead of enjoying the solitude, his mind kept wandering back to Rachel. Her smile, her laughter, the way she always seemed to make him feel seen in ways he hadn't realized he craved. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but the thought of her was always there, lingering just beneath the surface. That evening, Rachel had stayed late to finish up some extra chores Clara had asked her to do. It was one of those nights where Scott had no plans, and the idea of sitting around the house, waiting for Clara and Sophie to return, felt increasingly stifling. Rachel offered to make him a drink, a suggestion he hesitated to accept, knowing it would blur the lines further. But in the end, he didn't want to be alone with his thoughts, so he agreed. They sat together on the patio, the soft glow of the outdoor lights casting a warm hue on their conversation. The evening was calm, the neighborhood quiet, and as Rachel spoke about her plans for the future, Scott found himself listening intently. There was an innocence about her, an excitement for life that he hadn't seen in years. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time alive. The casual conversations they had once shared evolved, shifting to deeper, more personal topics. Rachel talked about her dreams of going to college, her hopes for independence, and how she felt about relationships. Scott, in turn, began opening up about his own frustrations. He spoke of his work, the pressures of his career, and how the constant hustle had affected his relationship with Clara. There was an honesty in Rachel's presence that Scott found refreshing. He didn't feel judged or burdened by expectations, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone truly understood him. As the conversation deepened, Scott couldn't help but notice how close they had become. She was sitting across from him, their knees almost touching. There was a tension in the air now, unspoken but undeniable. When she laughed at one of his jokes, her eyes held a different kind of look, something more knowing, more suggestive. Scott could feel his pulse quicken. His rational mind tried to remind him of his commitments, his family, his marriage, but the pull he felt toward Rachel was undeniable. Rachel, sensing the shift in the air, leaned in a little closer. She smiled, her gaze lingering on him in a way that felt charged. In that moment, Scott realized how much he had been craving someone who made him feel desired, appreciated, and young again. There was no judgment in Rachel's eyes, no expectation, only a quiet understanding. It was intoxicating. And then, without thinking, it happened. The barrier that had been holding them both back collapsed. When Rachel reached out to hand him his drink, their fingers brushed, and the spark that had been growing between them finally ignited. Scott's heart raced as he met her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a moment of sheer attraction, raw and unfiltered, and in that instant, it was clear neither of them wanted to pull away. What started as a simple brush of the fingers turned into something more. Their eyes locked, and the world around them seemed to fade. For a brief, stolen moment, Scott forgot everything: his marriage, his daughter, his life. All that mattered was the pull between him and Rachel. He leaned forward, and without a word, their lips met in a kiss. It was gentle at first, tentative, but as the kiss deepened, it was clear neither of them was willing to stop. The moment felt endless, like something that had been building for months, waiting to explode. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a release of everything they had both been silently yearning for. When they finally pulled away, there was a brief silence, one heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Scott's mind raced, but his body was still tingling from the touch of Rachel's lips. Rachel, looking at him with a mix of excitement and uncertainty, broke the silence. But Scott didn't answer immediately. His mind was reeling, the reality of what they had just done sinking in. He knew he couldn't undo it. He couldn't go back to the way things were before, no matter how hard he tried. The kiss had changed everything, and there was no turning back now. As Rachel stood to leave that evening, there was an unspoken agreement between them this would continue. What had started as a harmless flirtation had now crossed the line into something far more dangerous. Neither of them could see the consequences of what they had just set in motion, but they both knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. As the days passed, the affair between Scott and Rachel deepened, becoming more reckless with each passing moment. What had started as a kiss in the quiet of the evening grew into secret meetings and stolen moments throughout the week. They found ways to spend time alone, late nights, quiet conversations, lingering touches. What had once felt thrilling now felt dangerously familiar, like a temptation neither could resist. Scott found himself thinking about Rachel at all hours of the day. He would glance at his phone, eager to see a message from her, a text that wasn't just about Sophie or the day's mundane events, but something that felt far more intimate, far more dangerous. Rachel had become an obsession, and every conversation, every touch, only made it worse. He knew this wasn't sustainable, but the pull he felt toward her seemed stronger than any sense of responsibility. Rachel, on the other hand, was growing impatient. She had always known what she wanted, and now that she had Scott's attention, she wasn't going to let it slip away. She was no longer content with being the secret, the one on the periphery of his life. She wanted more. She wanted him to choose her. She wanted him to leave Clara, to start a life with her. Rachel had always believed that if she could make someone see her the way Scott saw her, it would be enough. And now, with everything she had learned about Scott, she believed she could have it all. But as her feelings for him grew, so did her frustration. She could see the distance between them, the way Scott still clung to the idea of his family, to the life he had built with Clara. Late one night, when Clara was away visiting her mother, Rachel confronted Scott. The tension between them was unbearable, and she could no longer hide her desires. She didn't want to share him any longer. She wanted Scott to understand that the affair wasn't just a fling, it was something real. But when she pushed him to commit, to leave Clara and build a life with her, Scott hesitated. The hesitation didn't come from a lack of desire, it was the reality of what leaving his wife and daughter would mean. It wasn't just the loss of his marriage, it was the end of everything he had worked for, everything he had once believed in. Scott loved his family, despite the growing distance between him and Clara. The thought of walking away from them left him conflicted and torn. Rachel didn't understand. To her, Scott's hesitation was a betrayal, a sign that he didn't truly care about her. He had been the one to seek her out, the one to kiss her, the one to bring her into his life. Now, when it came time to make a choice, he hesitated, unsure of the consequences. She began to feel desperate, and desperation, as she had learned in the past, could lead to dangerous decisions. Rachel's demands became more intense. She couldn't be ignored anymore. She sent Scott messages at all hours of the night, asking him why he hadn't made a decision, why he hadn't chosen her. She no longer kept their relationship a secret, and when Scott tried to pull back, she pushed harder. She didn't care about the consequences, she wanted Scott, and she wanted him now. As Rachel's obsession grew, Scott's guilt intensified. He began to avoid her, keeping his distance as much as he could. But Rachel wouldn't let him go so easily. She began showing up at the house unannounced, dropping by when Clara was out, and doing everything she could to remind Scott of their bond. It was as though she could see right through him, could sense his inner turmoil, and the more he tried to push her away, the more aggressive she became. In the meantime, Clara was noticing the subtle changes in Scott's behavior. He was quieter, more distracted, and had begun staying late at work more often. She attributed it to stress, to the demands of his career, but her intuition told her something was off. She couldn't pinpoint the cause, but the tension between them was palpable. When Scott would come home late, she would sense that he had been somewhere else with someone else, but she couldn't prove it. And it ate at her. She didn't know how or when, but deep down, Clara felt the unmistakable presence of betrayal creeping into their lives. Scott was at a crossroads. He knew that something had to give. The affair with Rachel had become more than just a secret, it was a force that threatened to tear apart his life. But as much as he tried to resist, he found himself drawn back into her orbit, unable to escape the grip of his own desires. Rachel's anger and obsession were reaching a boiling point, and Scott knew that soon he wouldn't be able to keep up the charade any longer. Something had to change, and when it did, it would be impossible to undo. The tipping point came on a night that should have been like any other. Clara had taken Sophie to a sleepover at a friend's house, leaving Scott alone with his thoughts. He had intended to spend the evening catching up on work, but instead, he found himself staring at his phone, scrolling through old messages from Rachel. Each one felt heavier than the last: her demands, her anger, her insistence that he make a choice. The words were suffocating, but they had also become a constant in his life. He couldn't escape them. At that moment, Scott knew something had to change. He was suffocating under the weight of his own choices, and the longer he delayed confronting Rachel, the more destructive their affair would become. He couldn't keep lying to Clara, to Sophie, to himself. His marriage was hanging by a thread, and he knew that the secrets he'd been keeping would eventually unravel everything. Rachel's calls had become more frequent. She would call at odd hours, leaving messages that ranged from desperate to furious. It was as if she had stopped seeing the affair for what it was: a fleeting, reckless mistake, and began seeing it as her future, as something she was entitled to. Scott could no longer deny it. The affair had morphed into something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Rachel's obsession with him was spiraling, and her anger at being ignored was becoming uncontrollable. The night Scott had been dreading finally arrived. Rachel showed up at the house uninvited, knocking on the door without warning. She had insisted on meeting him, demanding to know why he was still hesitating, why he wasn't taking her seriously. Scott, desperate to keep the situation from spiraling out of control, opened the door. The look in her eyes made it clear that there was no going back. She wasn't there for a conversation, she was there to force his hand. Her presence was overwhelming, her words accusatory and sharp. She accused him of leading her on, of promising things he couldn't deliver. The anger in her voice made Scott uneasy, but it was also laced with fear. Rachel was desperate, and desperation made people do things they might not otherwise consider. She stood in the doorway, blocking him from retreating back into the safety of his home. When he tried to tell her it was over, that he couldn't leave Clara, she wouldn't hear it. She demanded that he make a choice right then and there, or she would do something he would regret. Scott tried to reason with her, but the more he spoke, the more irrational Rachel became. She accused him of lying, of betraying her, and in her fury she started to break things. She stormed through the house, knocking over a vase and shattering a picture frame, her actions becoming erratic. Scott's heart raced, but he was paralyzed with indecision. He knew he needed to stop this, but his mind was clouded with guilt, fear, and a deep, nagging sense of responsibility toward Clara. Rachel's anger had reached its peak. Her eyes were wild and her voice trembled with a mix of hurt and rage. She finally shouted, "You never loved me. You never cared. You just wanted a distraction." Scott, overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation, backed away from her, trying to find a way to diffuse the tension. But Rachel wasn't having it. She stepped closer, her hands shaking as she grabbed at him. "You don't get to walk away from me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you ruin my life." Before Scott could react, she pushed him. Not hard, but with enough force to send him stumbling back against the wall. The shock of it left him stunned, and in that brief moment, Rachel turned and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Scott stood there, breathless and shaken, trying to process what had just happened. The house was eerily silent now, the broken vase and scattered objects a stark reminder of the chaos Rachel had left behind. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time he realized how deep the danger had become. Rachel was no longer someone he could control, someone he could keep at arm's length. She was someone capable of violence, someone desperate enough to destroy everything. He knew in that instant that he had made a terrible mistake. The affair had turned into something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And now there would be consequences that would reverberate through his life, his marriage, and his family. Scott's mind raced as he stood in the wreckage of what was once a calm, orderly home. Rachel's outburst had shattered everything. He knew he had to make a decision, one that would either save his family or condemn it forever. But as the hours passed, the weight of the choices ahead felt more unbearable than ever.